From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Hello, everyone. I am Betsy Peterson, the director of the American Folklife Center, and I want to welcome you here today for the first of our 2018 lectures as part of the Benjamin Botkin Lecture Series. The Botkin Series, for those of you who don't know, is an opportunity for the American Folklife Center to highlight the work of leading scholars and researchers in the disciplines of folklore, ethnomusicology, oral history, and cultural heritage. It also is an opportunity for us to enhance our collections here at the AFC. The Botkin lectures form an important facet of our collections. Each lecture is videotaped and becomes a part of the permanent collections here at the library. In addition, the lectures are later posted as as webcasts on the library's website, where they are available for viewing to internet patrons throughout the world. So with that caveat, let me ask you, if you do have your cell phone on, please turn it off now, or any other electronic devices. But on to our lecture. Today, I have the pleasure of introducing Washington-based journalist, researcher, and author Rick Massimo for a Botkin lecture highlighting the history of the Newport Folk Festival. Rick drew on his extensive interviews and in-depth archival research about the festival for his recently released book from Wesleyan University Press, I Got a Song, A History of the Newport Folk Festival. I'm very happy to point out that he also did much of the research for this book here at the library in the American Folklife Center archive. And I want to urge everyone to please stick around after the lecture to talk with Rick, buy a copy of the book, and there will be a book signing just out in the entryway there. Established more than a half century ago in Newport, Rhode Island, the festival has become an American musical institution. Over the years, the Newport Festival has shaped and influenced the American public's understanding of folk music, introducing audiences to deeply rooted traditional artists and now classic folk repertoires, as well as by introducing newer interpretations of folk, a generation of singer-songwriters, and featuring legendary performances. Today, Rick explores Newport's impact on the American folk music scene, relates a few of the many stories about fabled Newport Festival performances, and discusses how the iconic festival has reemerged as an influential focal point for a new generation of performers and fans. And once again, the talk will be followed by a book signing in the outside foyer. So please join me in welcoming Rick Massimo for his Botkin lecture, I Got a Song, A History of the Newport Folk Festival.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. The Newport Folk Festival started in 1959, and since then it's undergone a number of regenerations and a number of reinventions. And one of the things that I noticed immediately is that the two questions it continues to ask every year are, what is folk music and what can it do? And there's no one answer to that. There are a lot of answers to that. And I also quickly realized that the fact that there are so many different answers to that, that is the answer. In fact, one of the chapters of the book, that influenced the entire structure and the writing of that chapter, and we'll get to that in a minute. So the Newport Folk Festival was begun by George Wein in 1959. He had started running the Newport Jazz Festival in 1954. He also ran the nightclub Storyville in Boston, and in 1959 he brought Odetta in to do what they used to call at the time the 8-day week. That was 7 shows, one show each night for a week and a matinee on Sunday. And what he noticed very quickly was that nobody was coming to the shows, except the Sunday matinee was completely packed. It was completely packed by kids from Harvard University and MIT, and like George says, they were all drinking ginger ale. I wasn't making any money selling drinks to them. But Odetta was the queen of folk music, and the place was completely packed, and he realized something is actually going on here. And this was at a time when folk music was probably the most popular music of the day. It was sort of in one of the troughs of rock and roll's history, that folk music with groups like the Kingston Trio, the Chad Mitchell Trio, the Brothers Four, these were hit makers at the time. And George Wein didn't really know that, but he didn't know much about that world of music, but he saw that it was popular, and he saw that something was happening. So he began to have long discussions with Odetta's manager, Albert Grossman, and together they decided to have a folk afternoon at the Newport Jazz Festival. And it wasn't long before he realized, no, there's actually enough interest here to have an entire folk festival. So that's what they did. But like I said, he was not very conversant in the world of folk music, and he needed what I refer to in the book as a native guide. He had several native guides in the course of the history of the folk festival, and Albert Grossman was the first one. Pete Seeger, of course, and this is from the first festival.
Whenever you see a young banjo player anywhere in the country with a banjo waist high, head back, Adam's apple bobbing, you can say like Kilroy, Pete Seeger has been there. Here then is America's tuning fork, Pete Seeger.
This song, the words were written by a man in Wales, a man who was raised as a coal miner. And he rewrote a little old nursery rhyme. The nursery rhyme originally said, "Oranges and lemons," said the bells of St. Clemens. But he rewrote it for all the bells in the little mining towns of his home.
Right. Well, that clip started right at the very beginning, and the edit that I had in there didn't actually take. So we'll move on. But what I wanted to say about Pete Seeger and the first festival is that right at the beginning, the argument, the dispute over what real folk music was began right then. On the last day of the folk festival, the Kingston Trio were supposed to be the headliners. They were supposed to finish the night out, and one of the co-organizers, Louis Lorillard, he was one of the organizers of the jazz festival as well. He was getting besieged by people all day. Can you put the Kingston Trio on a bit earlier? It's Sunday night. I got to get home. I got a babysitter, etc. So finally, he did that, and Earl Scruggs, who was supposed to go on before the Kingston Trio, they put him last. Problem was, after the Kingston Trio were done, they had Charlie on the MTA, Saro, they had Tom Dooley. After all these hits, people were charged up. They were going crazy. They wanted them to stay. When Earl Scruggs came on, everyone said, everyone was bored by this, and everyone was chanting for the Kingston Trio to come back on. Even I believe it was Dave Guard, one of the members of the Kingston Trio, and came out and said, "Guys, please, come on, show some respect." Didn't work. He did a couple of songs and they left, and the Kingston Trio came back on. This was a problem in the folk music world at the time, and George Wein will tell you he lost a lot of respect in the folk music world over that. But that conflict actually started even beforehand. The day before, it was the second day of the first Newport Folk Festival, and there was a panel discussion on what on whether what was being presented at the Newport Folk Festival was sufficiently real folk music, and whether it was going to destroy genuine folk music, and whether the mass production of music was going to lead to a bland, monochromatic world. So these are things that happened right from the beginning, and they're continuing today. Joan Baez, of course, she was probably the discovery of the first festival. She did a guest spot with Bob Gibson, and it was unannounced. In fact, John Cohen told me that he had been chatting up Joan Baez for a couple of days, and finally on that last evening, she said, excuse me, I got to go do something with this guy. And I don't know what that is, but he watched, and she got up with him, and she sang, and the whole place went crazy. And let's see what we have this time. Shorter than I intended, but never mind. So after the second Newport Folk Festival in 1960, the festival came up to one of its hiatuses that it's had over the years. Essentially what happened is that the Jazz Festival, which was the week afterwards, there was rioting and destruction in the streets of Newport not from people who were in the festival, but the whole crowd outside the festival. There weren't rock festivals at the time. It wasn't the kind of place. So it was sort of your mass happening kind of. It was sort of your mass happening that would bring droves of young people to Newport, some of whom went in to hear the music, and some of whom had just come to cause trouble. So after the 1960 festival, the Newport festivals were kicked out of Newport for a couple of years. They came back in 1963. In 1963, there were a couple of major changes to the way the festival was run. First of all, Albert Grossman was out. He was too busy with his own work. Pete Seeger became what I would call the second native guide to folk music for George Wein. And it reorganized as a nonprofit festival. And that may sound like inside baseball, but what happened, the main point of the structure of the nonprofit was that every artist got $50 a day, whether you were Bob Dylan or Joan Baez or the second fiddler for Cousin Emmy's band, you got $50 a day, and the proceeds from that went into a nonprofit foundation that was dedicated to the discovery and the promulgation of folk music and indigenous music nationwide. There was also at the time a strong current of social justice that ran through the festival. This is probably the capstone moment. This is, let's see, that's Peter, Paul, and Mary, Joan Baez, Bob Dylan, the Freedom Singers, Pete Seeger, and Theo Bickel singing "We Shall Overcome" at the end of the Saturday of the 1963 festival. Bickel later called it the supreme moment in the National Seance. And one of the things that I think is important to note is that this is a song that already existed. I think that, in fact, this wasn't even the first time that this song was sung in Newport. Guy Carolan sang it in 1960. But it's a matter of context. It's not just the performers and it's not just the song that make a musical moment iconic. It's the audience and it's the time that it comes in. This was July 1963. A month later was the March on Washington. A couple of weeks after that was the Birmingham church bombing. And, you know, the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act were still in the future. So this is why this is the moment that stuck, because this was it was a large, it had an impact. Soon after this, President Johnson was saying that, you know, that the problem, the civil rights problem is not just a Negro problem, it's a problem for all of us to overcome, and we shall overcome. And that was kind of an earth-shaking moment for a president to say something like that. It was, you know, all I can relate it to is a president saying Black Lives Matter, or you know, this was a the civil rights movement was still considered a radical kind of fringe at the time, and for a president to pick up a phrase like that was significant. And of course, it wasn't just because of the Newport Folk Festival, but it was a sign of where the folk movement was, and the Newport Festival was at the forefront of that. Okay, so that's Lightnin' Hopkins. And one of the other key moments of the 1963 festival was the discovery and the rediscovery and the presentation of blues singers such as himself, such as Mississippi John Hurt. This was part of what the nonprofit structure did. People were, and the Newport people weren't the only people, but there were people going down in the South and finding these singers who had recorded a couple of sides at the time, you know, in the 30s and 40s or so, but no one had seen them ever since. In the case of Mississippi John Hurt, for example, he came to the Newport Festival in 1963, and somebody told him, "You're not Mississippi John Hurt. Mississippi John Hurt is dead. I have that on reliable authority." And in fact, Dick Spotswood, one of the people who discovered him, you know, it's a funny story, but he said, well, let's see. He has a song called. He explained how they found him. They said, well, you know, we figured he had a song called Avalon Blues, and said Avalon's my home, and his name is Mississippi John Hurt, so he's probably from Mississippi. So let's see if there's a town called Avalon, Mississippi. And so they had to get, like, you know, south of the Mason-Dixon line before they could even find a map that had Avalon, Mississippi on it. But there was, so they found it, and once they found somebody in Avalon, Mississippi, they stopped the car and they got out and they said, "Do you know a guy named John Hurt?" He said, "What, guitar player?" He said, "Yeah." He goes, "Oh yeah, he's right over there." And that's how they found him. This kind of field work was one of the very important aspects of the nonprofit Newport Folk Festival of the mid-'60s. Right, so that is a Cajun band consisting of Adam Landreneau, Cyprien Landreneau, and Jerry DeVilliers. That was at the 1965 festival. At the 1964 festival, which I could not find a picture of, an ad hoc Cajun band with Dewey Balfa as a substitute guitar player came to the Newport Festival And that was the first time that Cajun music had been performed in a large sort of concert setting outside of Louisiana. And the thing about that was a lot of people in Louisiana said that they shouldn't go. There were op-eds in the newspapers saying they shouldn't come, they shouldn't leave Louisiana because Cajuns were considered these backwards, embarrassing kind of people, and they were also considered these sort of, they were second, third generation immigrants, but they were basically not real, they were not the real thing. And in fact, I've been told a lot of Cajuns felt the same way. They said, no, they shouldn't go up there and play. They're just going to embarrass us and the entire state of Louisiana. Of course, that didn't happen. And the place went crazy. I've pulled a little sleight of hand. That cut is actually from the Cajun Band's 1964 performance. And what happened there was twofold. An entire, fans from all over the country came and they heard Cajun music, and suddenly you had Cajun fans from all over the country, and there was hospitable territory for Cajun musicians to travel and play across the U.S. And at the same time, Dewey Balfa especially came back to Louisiana and said, we just knocked people up. We just got a standing ovation in Newport, Rhode Island. And I come back here and you act like you don't know me. This is not right. This is, my culture is not a second-class culture. And he was determined that it was going to be respected and that it was going to be known. And that is what happened. With help, funding from the Newport Folk Foundation, among others, they started holding Cajun music mini festivals and contests and concerts in Louisiana, and that became instrumental in popularizing and bringing sort of a cultural respect to Cajun music and culture in Louisiana itself. So it worked inside the state and it worked outside the state. Bob Jones, who I'll get to in a moment, told me a story. He was on one of these road trips. They were scouting out talent to play at the Newport Festival. And he and Ralph Rinsler and Revon Reed and a couple other people were in this car driving along the road, and they stopped and asked this Cajun guy for directions. I believe it was Ralph Rinsler who asked for directions. And the guy gave them the directions, and then he asked them, You're not Cajun. How do you know my language? And Ralph Rinsler said, well, I learned it in school. And he said, school? You learned this language in school? He said, yeah, books, teachers, I learned it. He said, people write this language down? He had no idea. And so the effect that, Bob Jones will tell you, the effect that this had on him, to know that his language was something that was in books and that was taught in school, the effect that it had on him was he was just completely blown away by this. And he'll tell you that was one of the great moments he had when he was traveling through the South. And that, again, that's part of what the nonprofit structure of the Newport Folk Festival was able to accomplish. We know who this is. So that's Bob Dylan going electric at Newport in 1965. That was his first performance with an electric guitar and a full backup band. That's one of those sort of seismic moments that affected a lot of people in a lot of different ways. And thanks to, for example, Martin Scorsese's Dylan documentary, we kind of know what happened. We can hear the music. What we don't know is what's different is how it hit each person. When I started writing what became this book, I started it as a series of stories for the Providence Journal, where I was working at the time. I started asking people about this, and I started hearing, oh, the whole place went crazy. People were booing and throwing things. And I started hearing, well, people loved it. And I started hearing, well, it sounded great. It sounded terrible. People booed. Nobody booed. Well, I booed. And when I started to think of how I was going to write about this, it occurred to me that that is the answer to what actually happened at Newport that evening. Everyone has a different answer, and the fact that everyone has a different answer is the answer. And, I ask myself, is that a cop-out? But I don't think it is. You can listen to the tapes for yourself and decide what you think, but the fact is each person saw it differently, or at least there was an entire kaleidoscope of different reactions to it. It was a thrilling sort of look into the future. It was a betrayal. It was especially a sacrilege because he had done it at Newport. I feel like people couldn't have been that surprised because Like a Rolling Stone was the number 2 record in the country at the time. And he started off in 1963 with these denim work shirts and singing songs about the coal miners and that sort of thing. And then there's a wonderful moment of footage that Murray Lerner shot in 1964 of Bob Dylan playing Mr. Tambourine Man in solo acoustic, but Pete Seeger is sitting off to the side. He was one of the people who introduced him, and he's just sort of, well, I'm going to try to make sense of this. It's Bob, so I know that it's coming from a good place, but I don't. What is he talking about? And so this was the next step in the process, and of course by the end of that year, he had kind of left the folk music world behind entirely, and George Wein will tell you that too. He said by 1966, I knew we were having problems. So, like I say in the book, I mean, they thought he was going to sort of they thought he was going to shine a light on. I think they thought he was going to shine a light on the folk music world and who was in it, when in fact he sort of left a bit of scorched earth behind him where he had been, because there was still plenty of great music being made, but there was all sorts of conflict and recrimination. And the other thing that happened is simply he demonstrated for a lot of performers and then for a lot of audience members that you could have intelligent lyrics, you could have poetic lyrics, you could have evocative lyrics, and play rock and roll. And obviously the Beatles had something to do with that as well. But he influenced a lot of performers and a lot of fans to go off with him and play rock music, and that left the Newport Folk Festival in kind of a difficult place. Now, this is the finale of the 1967 festival. That is Judy Collins, Theo Bickel. I don't know who's right in the back. Then there's Arlo Guthrie, Mimi Farina, Joan Baez, Jim Kweskin, Maria Moldauer, and George Wein fitting in very perfectly with the rest of the attire on stage. I love that picture. Like I say, at this point, the festival was starting to run out of gas, and starting to run out of gas culturally, and more importantly, it was running out of money. They were continuing to plow money into the promotion and the promulgation of folk music and folk traditions, but the same kind of money wasn't coming in because you weren't getting Bob Dylan. You got Joan Baez that year, but for the most part, you didn't have Joan Baez. And the other thing is that the festival was getting too big for Newport. Newport at the time had about 30,000 people, and the total attendance, obviously there would be some repeaters, but the total attendance for the festival in 1967 or 68, I believe, was 70,000. You had people sleeping on the beach. You had people sleeping on people's front lawns and people's porches. This was, and not in an invited sense either. Some people in Newport loved it because they didn't have Airbnb at the time, but that's essentially what they did. They rented out rooms in their houses. But for the most part, it was becoming a massive headache for for Newport itself, and that became a huge collection of bad vibes all around. The same process happened at the Jazz Festival. In 1970, they canceled the Newport Folk Festival, and there was going to be a very small 1971 Newport Folk Festival, but there was a riot again at the 1971 Jazz Festival, while it reached a peak while Dionne Warwick was singing "What the World Needs Now." They trashed the stage, they trashed the piano. People invaded. Again, it was people invading from the outside, and at that point, Newport voted to eject both festivals. So the festivals left Newport in 1971. Around the mid-'80s, there was a resurgence in singer-songwriter folk music, which you can argue that is one of the many arguments. If it's by a singer-songwriter, is it really folk music? Is it only folk music if it's passed down from one unnamed Appalachian songwriter to another? These are open. Well, I don't know if they're open questions anymore, but I certainly still hear plenty of opinions on both sides of that. This is Tom Rush. In 1984, he made an important discovery that had resonance to the revival of the Newport Folk Festival. He did an annual Christmas show at, I believe it was the Channel in Boston. And he realized, he started that in the late 70s, and by the early 80s, he realized that attendance was kind of falling off the table. He realized that people weren't coming out to see the show anymore. And at the same time, this marketing student came to him and said, "Listen, can I do like a marketing questionnaire at your next Christmas show?" And he said, I don't know about him in marketing. All right, sure, fine, do what you want. So that he found out, and he said, at the middle of in the middle of the show, at the intermission, people were scribbling like it was a test in school. He said he loved it, but he actually found out from that his fans had, for lack of a better word, grown up. They were doctors, they were lawyers, they were professional people, and he had the insight. Well, instead of staying at the Channel or going someplace smaller and going fewer and fewer nights, he said, "I'm going to rent out freaking Symphony Hall." He said, "People don't want to go to a dingy place like the Channel is terrible. It's not there anymore. I'm glad. People want to, my fans want to go someplace. They have a couple of extra dollars. They're still out there." He was being told there's no more audience for your music, and he said, "This is ridiculous. This is the same generation that I grew up with, and if they haven't all died, it would be in the papers." So, so he rented out Symphony Hall, and he sold out Symphony Hall. So he went from not being able to fill 2 shows at a capacity of 400 per show to selling out Symphony Hall, which was about just short of 2,000. So that's when he realized something is going on here. And a number of people involved with the Newport Folk Festival realized that something was going on here as well. And that's when they decided to revive the festival. At the same time, the city of Newport was going through a lot of changes, and they realized that they needed large tourist events, and they were better able to handle them. And they also negotiated, the festival now, it has to be in the daytime, it has to be at Fort Adams, which is which is on a peninsula. The shows have to be over by 7 o'clock. The attendance is capped at 10,000. It became a very different festival with a very different crowd, but there were enough people together to revive it, and that's when the music changed again. This is Bob Jones. He started as a volunteer in 1963, and he, like I said, he was one of the people who traveled through the South, scouting out talent and interviewing, finding musicians. In the pre-internet days, it was just very much more difficult to say, let's find a panpipes player in Alabama, or let's find some black Cajun musicians, not Creole musicians, black Cajun musicians. This was a difficult thing when you couldn't just sort of like look it up, when you couldn't Google things. But he had been a singer-songwriter himself, and he sort of became the third native guide to the folk world for George Wein. And he brought that sound. He brought the more modern singer-songwriter sound. He also expanded the definition of folk music. A lot of people were a little bit like Los Lobos, Robert Cray. Do they really fit into this? But I found that Mike Seeger once wrote, and this was back in the mid '60s. Mike Seeger, Pete Seeger's half brother, said, we want to keep the festival within the bounds of performers who fit in I'm trying to remember now, what we think of as have some connection with the traditions of folk music. And those words, some connections, mean a lot, and they can mean a lot of different things. And he used that to sort of grow the popularity of the festival and to expand the definition of folk music. And one of the things he did as well was to consult his daughter and her friends, because they were a new generation and they were listening to music that he didn't know anything about. Perfect example. So the Indigo Girls, they played at Newport 9 years out of 10. I believe it was 1988 or 89 to 1998, 1989. They headlined each time. They were by far the most popular act at the festival. They loved the festival as well. Amy Ray once told me that actually her favorite moments from the Newport Folk Festival weren't about playing. They were about hearing other people play. They're about hearing. They're about her family coming and being able to relax and see old friends and hear old friends. And not everybody who was a longtime attendee of Newport felt that way, because a lot of their fans would sort of helicopter in, so to speak, for their set, and then helicopter back out, and sort of push their way to the front at the same time. So it was a little bit of a, there was a little bit of a schism there, but there's no doubt that they were one of the most popular acts of the festival for many years, and they expanded the definition of folk music, and they were one of the main female artists in the history of the festival. So they sort of expanded the definition of who could play at the festival and who could draw an enormous crowd at the festival.
Who was this?
That was the Indigo Girls.
Oh yeah, I thought so. Right.
Right. Now, this is George Wein. He's at second from the right. His wife Joyce is second from the left, and that is Pop Staples and the Staples Singers. When George and Joyce Wein got married in 1959, their marriage was illegal in 19 states. And one of the things he told me that he wanted to do with the folk festival was the idea that it was an activist festival was not an accident. I asked him about that. He told me some of the moments that happened in terms of relations between groups of people from Alabama and black performers from South Carolina and white performers from Alabama, and he said that these were very beautiful moments. And I said, you knew what you were doing. You made these moments happen, didn't you? And he said, well, yeah, I did. We kind of had to do that if we wanted to be what we wanted to represent. He explained to me that the jazz festival that's where you demonstrate an integrated world, and the folk festival is where you agitate for one. And one of my favorite stories that he ever told me was about the founding of the New Orleans Jazz and Heritage Festival. They invited him down there, and the first time they invited him to create a festival, they said, well, we'll have one side of the we'll have one side of the field for the white audience and another side for the black audience. We'll just have a rope in the middle. And he said, well, you can't do that. I mean, first of all, you're asking me to bring in Duke Ellington and these giants of jazz, and they have integrated bands, and they have contracts. They won't play for segregated audiences. They said, well, all right. And they actually huddled over it. And he said, they're trying to figure out a way around their own laws. This is really strange. But finally they couldn't. They said, well, we'll try again in a few years. They tried again in a few years. And then they found out, there was another incident of segregation in New Orleans over accommodations for football players at an all-star game. And they said, well, I guess we're just not ready for this. And a couple of years after that, they said, okay, I think we're ready, and we're going to start a New Orleans Jazz and Heritage Festival. And they had somebody else run it. And George Wein said, well, why did you pick somebody else to run this festival? And they said, well, your wife's black, and we can't, we're just not ready for that here. And a year later, after the festival had been kind of disastrous, they invited him back and said, well, yeah, sure, come on down and run the festival. And he said, well, what happened to the other guy? Well, don't worry about the other guy. And one of the things he said was, I don't change. Well, let me start by saying, he said, I never wanted to be a rebel. I didn't want to live outside of society. I wanted respect like my father had. He was a doctor. He had respect. I wanted respect. I've accomplished things. I'm a businessman. I want that kind of respect. And he said, I didn't marry Joyce because I wanted to rebel against society. I married Joyce because that's who I wanted to be with. And he said, I don't compromise who I am, but at the same time, I don't tell people that they're wrong. They have to find out for themselves that they're wrong, and they'll find out. And I thought that was, I loved that story. It's one of my favorite stories that George has told me, and it's one of the centers of the book. I think is one of the, it's one of the things that drove me to write about the festival in the first place. So by about 2009, this is Tom Morello. He played there in 2009 as in his persona as the Night Watchman. And these are the Avett Brothers, and this was another evolution in the sound of folk music. Whoop. Sorry. Right. That didn't cut off when it was supposed to either, but never mind. The Avett Brothers, in 2006, I believe it was, the Newport Folk Festival had one of its least auspicious bookings ever. That was Jimmy Buffett. He said at the time that he had come up a young singer-songwriter in Cambridge and that he was going to do a show that reflected that. And I think a lot of people, including myself, thought, well, all right. I mean, Margaritaville is kind of a, it's actually a sad song if you think about it. This could actually work. Yeah, no, it didn't work. He came there with his entire band. He sort of blew the doors out of the place. But an interesting thing happened. Again, there's another situation where all his fans kind of helicoptered in to see him, and everyone else made for the exits. But when they did, they went past the Avett Brothers. They weren't supposed to be playing at the time, but there had been a rain delay, so they were still playing. And people went crazy over them. They were they thought they were heading to the parking lot, but they stopped at the tent, and the crowd just sort of swelled and swelled and swelled. And one of my friends who covered the festival for the Newport Daily News asked some of the young people there, how did you, I never heard of these guys. They're great, but I never heard of them. How did you find out about them? And they said, well, it's the internet. There's their websites, their music's all over the internet. And so that was a new sort of, to me, that's sort of a new form of word of mouth that sort of spreads the word about artists that older people such as myself don't know about. And to me, that's a continuation of the kind of folk music, the folk tradition that's there. Now, this is the 2009 festival. I'm going quick because we are almost out of time. This was the 2009 festival, the 50th anniversary festival. George Wein had sold after his wife died, George Wein sold his operations to a startup company who lasted a couple of years before they went completely broke. And with 3 months until the 50th anniversary of the Newport Folk Festival, there was no festival. So they had to bang up something very quickly without a lot of money. And Colin Malloy of the Decemberists told me that he had been told, his agent told them, we have no idea whether they're going to actually be able to pay you. And he said, I don't actually care. The point was to celebrate the Newport Festival, and that's when a lot of people found out how important that festival had been to a lot of people who are still alive and kicking and making new music today. A lot of young people who are still active, and they may be talking about the '80s festival, and they sort of know the history of the '60s festival, and in a way, what the festival did was turn that history from sort of an albatross into something that they celebrate and that they recreate. And at this time, one of the people from that startup operation, his name is Jay Sweet, he sort of became the fourth native guide to folk music. And one of his big tenets was that just because you started off playing electric guitar in a bar to people who are drinking beer, you aren't necessarily less of a folk artist than someone who started playing to an acoustic guitar to people who are drinking coffee. Okay, so that was Alindra Lee Seeger and Hooray for the Riff Raff. They played there last year. Superficially, it's a very different sound. It's all electric. You have those very 80s sounding keyboards. But to me, the lyric of the song and the spirit of the song is, I sense a very blues influence there. And to me, that's an example of the connection that artists still have with. That's part of that connection that Mike Seeger was talking about, and it's the connection that artists of today still have with the artists who we think of as undeniably folk music, whereas we think it's maybe some sort of different thing now. And I will just wrap up with this is the finale of the 2015 festival. It was the 50th anniversary of Bob Dylan going electric, and so we have. What we have here is these are the point I try and make at the end is that this is music that was they're playing songs that were not considered folk music at the time, but if you have this many people singing a song that they didn't write and that everyone knows, well, that's folk music right there. This happens to be Rainy Day Women number 12 and 35, I believe it is. And everybody knows it. And if you were there, I mean, this is a folk music moment. It wasn't, and so was Maggie's Farm. That's on the left-hand microphone there. That's the guy from Dawes, Taylor Goldsmith from Dawes, and he's playing the guitar that Bob Dylan played in 1965, and this is, to me, that's a folk music moment. And one of the things I say in the book is that we think of this as going through as these very discrete periods, but when you really look at them, what you actually have, I think, is one conversation that is stretched out over a lifetime. So thank you, and I'll take any questions. Yes.
Okay, well, here we go. I thought it was very interesting when you mentioned that, the conflicts between the Kingston Trio type stuff and the stuff that were directly connected to traditions. And singer-songwriters and all that. And it definitely, those divisions have continued because you have the British stuff that went electric, and that was controversial over there. And just fast forwarding, without taking up this whole thing, is now there are all kinds of fusions going on with people taking stuff from all sorts of ethnic traditions and mixing it with electronics, or bluegrass meets Brazil meets funk, all kinds of things like that. And is it folk? Is it world? It doesn't even matter. It is connected to a tradition, even if it sounds rather different from what someone's used to.
Well, yeah, and one of the things I like to point out, and I pointed out in the book, is that I think as soon as they invented records, this was going to happen. I mean, once you learned songs from somewhere other than your dad, you were going to learn songs from people other than the people you grew up with, and so this was going to happen. Yes.
Thank you for your insights. I especially like the fact that you had this parallel story of both festivals in Newport, the Jazz Festival and the Folk Festival. And I was looking through your book, and you mentioned that there was seed money for the earlier festival, the Jazz Festival, from the Lorillard family, and I guess tobacco money.
I believe so.
Yeah. Oh, okay. But then throughout the decades, there was a lack of money for at least the Folk Festival. Did Lorillard money help seed the Folk Festival too? And then, okay, well, what with these wealthy families there, housed in these so-called cottages, why was there not money? Because they were benefiting in a way from the tourism and everything. Why were they not also helping to fund the Folk Festival?
The people in the wealthy people were not benefiting from the festival, or at least they didn't think they were. These were their summer houses, and they were there for peace and quiet. The business people of Newport really liked it. The people who had an extra room to rent out, they really liked it. Now, of course, in Newport, there was kind of after the Gilded Age, there was kind of an exodus from Newport. And so that's why you had empty mansions, and you had people who needed, you had regular people who needed, and a regular city who needed tourism and that sort of thing. But yeah, no, the wealthy people, honestly, the Jazz Festival was a one-off. Not a one-off, obviously, but you know what I mean. It was a unique set of circumstances, is what I'm saying. Elaine Lorillard was bored. She was kind of the black sheep of Newport society, and I honestly think she liked jazz. She and her husband went to Storyville a lot, and that's how they met George Wein. But people who knew her tell me that, yeah, there was definitely part of her that just wanted to piss Newport society off, and that's why she started the seed money for the Jazz Festival. Yes.
I've been involved in programming the Washington Folk Festival for the last about 30 years now, and so we've gone through a lot of the same kind of struggles that I heard, and I actually kind of relieved to hear. I didn't know that the Newport Festival had actually not happened a few years, so we're 38 years. I guess that was a pretty good run. But I, in terms of what's allowed, we've had a lot of evolution. I've always been sort of on the let's be more modern end, but there have been others that have served on that committee over the years who are, we should be, English ballads, and that's it, But what I wanted to say is we do audition a lot of groups, and to your point, there's a lot of fusion things. What do we do with singer-songwriters, and how do you define that tradition? And I have a definition. It's kind of like pornography. You can't really define it, but I know it when I hear it. And I think that is about as close as you can get.
Two things that people told me, or that I read, that I think really informed that. One was that in the program for the first Newport Folk Festival, Pete Seeger wrote a list of made out, a definition of folk music. And it said, let's see, no bel canto singing, no notes on paper, no songs that were written specifically to be hits. And I'm reading it was a longer list than that. But I remember reading it and thinking, this list is no, 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 no. And I thought, well, once you start talking about, when everybody who starts defining folk music starts, in my experience, starts talking about what folk music isn't. And I feel like once you stop talking about what folk music isn't and start talking about what it is, it becomes a lot harder to define, and a lot more stuff comes into it. The other one, it jives with what I said about We Shall Overcome. Dar Williams, I believe it was, said to me, what makes folk music is the audience, and an audience that's really listening and that's letting the music affect their lives. I think that's part of the definition of folk music as well. And the other thing I should point out is that I was rushing there at the end, but the Newport Folk Festival is as popular now as it's ever been. I don't know that they'd ever get 70,000 people, but their audience is limited to 10,000 people, and they have a 3-day festival, and it sells out before the acts are announced. People buy the tickets just because they know it's going to be really good. In fact, Jay Sweet told me that they've toyed with never announcing the acts. You buy the ticket and then you just show up and you see what you see. There are some good reasons not to do that. Essentially, the smaller acts, the lesser known acts, would like to be able to tell people that they're there. But it's there are reasons, there are interesting reasons for it. And so, to me, and this is also in the book, but the thing about English ballad singers, that's great, but there's probably somewhere else to hear them. That was one of the things that happened to the Newport Festival in the 90s, is that so many of these acts between small venues for the quote unquote real folk singers and casinos for bigger acts like Mary Chapin Carpenter or Los Lobos or Alison Krauss, you could see a lot of these acts other places. So there had to be some other kind of appeal. So
Well, thank you very much,
Right.
Rick Massimo. Rick's going to have some copies of the book outside. He's going to be selling and signing, and we continue the conversation. So thank everybody for coming. We have another Botkin lecture, same time next week, also on Wednesday. Barry Burgee and Tom Pitch will be talking about a project to photograph and document National Heritage Award winners, and it's going to be a great show. So thank you, and thanks for coming, and thank you, Rick.
Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.